let's get on with our first conversation. So Anand Giridharadas is with us again today, and I'm going to read you some from his bio because I have a commentary about it. So Anand is an internationally best-selling author of multiple books and one of our foremost voices on democracy, overcoming division, and how humans make and resist and grapple with change. Now, I personally don't see how any of that's relevant in today's world, but whatever, Anand. That's some things we can all use. In his work as an author and a journalist and a regular political analyst, he points us toward real, meaningful change, wider human solidarity, and hope. If you'll please welcome Anand to the stage. Hey, how are you? Good to see you. All right.
Hi, everyone. First of all, speaking of narrative, your jacket is an entire narrative unto itself.
I bought this in Ghana a couple of months ago.
It's fantastic. Hi, everyone. It's great to, I think I was here exactly a year ago.
It was.
Like many of you were also. It's great to
And
be
this
back.
year you brought, as I said, you brought a valet with you.
I brought my 6-year-old daughter, Zora, who is doing some coloring work there. So everyone say hi to Zora.
And you're headed to Moab for this is father-daughter
Father-daughter
vacation.
adventure, yeah, out west.
And what's your wife doing with the other child?
She's driving north to Niagara Falls in New York.
Oh, okay.
So there, yeah, we sometimes do trips all together, and then sometimes for stress relief, we break up into factions.
Well, you
Nothing more stressful than a relaxing family vacation.
I know. Family vacations are a whole another thing.
Yeah.
So you were listening, you've been busy. But since we've got some new folks, and that may not be as up to date on kind of the narrative scenario. So why should anybody care? Start with that. Why should anybody care about narratives?
I think we live in a strange moment in time when the people who want to do good things in the world, and I would assume that's like 99% of people in this room, if not 100, often labor under an assumption that if you do the right thing, pass the right policies, have the right intentions, have the right data, have the right spreadsheets, if your heart is in the right place, if you're doing the work, then all those things should speak for themselves. And if you've ever studied human psychology, you know actually nothing speaks for itself. People don't absorb things through data about the number of bridges Joe Biden is funding. People don't absorb things based on information about how much worse inflation is in France than here. People mainly take in what they think about the world through kind of feeling and through stories. And we live in this time in which the people who want to do good things broadly, I think, don't think narrative is important. Again, I'm being very broad here, but broadly think doing the work is important. And the people who want to do the most vicious things, and it's getting pretty vicious on their side, have a brilliant understanding of the importance of narrative. They understand the importance of emotion. They understand that politics is primarily a psychological game. Mm-hmm. They understand that a story doesn't have to be true if it's good. And so what we have is this kind of asymmetric war where the people who want to build a bigger we and who want more progress for more people and who want all the things you were pointing out in these slides are putting themselves at a huge disadvantage The disadvantage is not just the other imposed things, gerrymandering, all these things that are, genuine structural disadvantages. There is a real internal disadvantage that we are imposing on ourselves by not taking narrative seriously, right? And you can look at examples, whether it's, this Biden administration of the last 3.5 years. I mean, it is off the charts on this ratio that I'm describing, off the charts on doing an incredible amount of good things and basically not taking story seriously. Not being good at it, but I think more importantly, not thinking it's important, or not thinking it's remotely on a par with, and part of what you saw this week when Vice President Harris came to the fore, and she's given one speech so far, 2 speeches. It's not a huge amount of narrative that's had a chance to happen. But for 72 hours or 96 hours, whatever it's been, the country has a new narrative already, right? Simply her being, but also some of the things she said very quickly, prosecutor versus felon, future versus past. Like, the amount of narrative work she did in the last 96 hours probably exceeded the amount of narrative work they'd done before that. And that's, again, I think that's for a lot of reasons. I think the president, as he has said, is not as young as he used to be. Narrative is maybe one of those things that is easier when you're youthful and full of energy and you're like full peak self. But it's interesting how energized the country feels in 4 days, how many volunteers they're having, I mean, the money that's coming in. I just feel like what happened, she's for the same policies as him. The policies didn't change. She didn't announce any new policy initiatives, right? What changed was the narrative.
And so what's the cost, not just to the Biden administration, but in general, what's the cost or the price you pay for not taking narrative seriously?
I think when you subscribe to this view of just doing the work, putting your head down, relying on the data, you ignore how people actually are, right? For those of you who are in marriages or long-term relationships, when have you won an argument by pointing out that you were in fact correct? Like, when has that saved you? Right? So what's interesting about our movements is, why do we know this on the interpersonal level? Or when your best friend comes to you after a breakup and is sobbing on your couch, no one in this room would be like, well, if you actually analyze the last 10 people you've dated, it's highly probabilistic that it would end in this kind of outcome. So you might want to consider a new strategic direction. Like, no one here would do that. But somehow, when we start talking about bigger stuff, we get real wonky. And we get real, and I think one of the weird dynamics is, because the authoritarians and the fascists and just the kind of the anti-democracy movement in this country has become more narrative and more emotion-driven, there's almost an effort to distinguish oneself from them by being more serious with a capital S. And it's actually the wrong lesson. So to your question, when you don't take narrative seriously, you don't take people seriously, right? And part of why, again, I was looking at your slides, if like, you weren't picking necessarily eternal issues, you're picking issues that are really big now, right? And so there's also the question of, why is narrative important now? It's always important. But I think we don't talk about the background conditions of America in this moment enough to explain the shit show. Sorry, Zora. And the background conditions, in a nutshell, are, and because progressive people generally are very bad at claiming their own accomplishments, you never hear this story. We have changed this country more in the last 60 years than it changed in many, many decades before that. Around the world, we've changed more in the status of women in the last 60 years than in the previous 60,000. Go down the list of groups, LGBT. Like, what was it like to be LGBT in like most villages in the world for most of human history? Think of how much progress we've made, like in the lifetimes of even young people in this room, right? We're changing the meaning of gender right before our eyes. My 6-year-old daughter, without batting an eye, I took her to the bathroom. She went to the women's, I went to the men's, and she said as she was going in, "Papa, what if someone was a they? Which bathroom would they be able to go to here?" It's a normal question for her, something that older people might struggle with, easy for her. Is everyone accommodated? So we have changed more and are changing more in the status of all kinds of people, in the level of power of all. We don't feel this way now because there's retrogression. But the retrogression is a backlash against an enormous amount of progress, which remains. Look at this room. Is there a photograph of a room like this from 1960? Right? 3/4 of people in this room wouldn't have been allowed to go to a conference for different reasons. Right? Legal, or just like the amount of cooking that needed to be done, or whatever. Right? Look at this room. This is real. This has been achieved by people. Right? People did this. And that level of change always inspires backlash. This level of change that we've lived through is always hard for people to cope with. It's hard for the people who benefit from it, and it's hard for the people who experience it as a headwind. And I think we have been very bad at the narrative aspect of helping lots of people figure out who they are through this transition, these transitions, and on the far side of change, right? Start with men. Rightfully so, we are and have been transforming the idea of men's role in society, the range of roles men are expected to play. Remember, an art historian friend once told me there's almost no paintings of men holding a baby until the 20th century, like in recorded human history, right? But we've been better at passing laws and banning certain behaviors, all the correct things, then we have it saying, wow, that's a large number of people who are kind of going to need to come up with a new idea of themselves. And either those of us who want progress help them come up with the new idea of themselves, or Jordan Peterson's going to do it.
So,
and you could say the same about race.
Yeah.
You could say the same about any number of things. People need to be helped to cope with change. And that coping requires narratives.
and so that, you said something I never thought about. Of course, I would suspect that people who don't like the change have a hard time coping. But I never thought about people who the change benefited would need help coping. Talk a little bit more about that.
I mean, think about, let's stick with the status of women, right? Mothers and grandmothers of women in this room had many fewer choices. That sucks. From an empowerment point of view, thriving, flourishing, sucks. But the advantage of having few choices is not a lot of anxiety about your choices. There's not a lot of roads not taken. There's one way to be a woman in this town, and that's how you are. So you have very low freedom and empowerment, but life's not that complicated. And the women I know, my wife, my friends, have the burden of an incredible amount of choice. Do I get married? Do I not? Do I have children? Do I not? Do I, chase ambition to the detriment of my social life and hope that it'll pay off later or not?
Yep.
The same burdens that anybody who's allowed to do anything faces, right? So just because women have been empowered does not mean women don't need help coping with the change, the new status. Because the definition of change is today's women were not raised by people who knew a lot about what today's women's lives are like, because they weren't allowed to do that. The same way a 25-year-old white kid today is not being raised by parents who were taught a lot about race 95% of the time. So that 25-year-old white boy needs to be a kind of man and a kind of white person that has no historical precedent in America, basically. but his parents are not going to be a guide to it unless there's some fluky exception, right? I don't think progressive forces actually offer much by way of cultural whatever. I think we're much better at offering like an end state. You better get there. And what I see happening is broadly the far right, but also just like cultural adjacencies to it. Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan, these kind of people, Andrew Tate, they understand this notion of kind of people who are narratively homeless, I would say, who kind of know that they can't quite be their granddaddy, but they're not yet in the narrative or sold on the narrative of the next thing they're going to be. And those forces, those podcasts or media, but also politicians, clearly, get in there and they offer a easy, convenient narrative home. You are feeling a little adrift because women are doing this to you. And again, I happen to personally disagree with all of the actual narratives people like that put out. But I admire their analysis of what is going on, which is that people between narratives need help. And I'll give you an example of where you don't hear this, right? So we have all these debates about banning books, history books, this and that, right? The right is obviously talking about this constantly. Here's why we should ban them. Here's why these slavery books are bad. Here's why these books about trans kids are bad. They're all up in that, right? And the response from like progressive forces is sort of, book banning's bad, freedom of speech, whatever. What there isn't is a bigger narrative that would be helpful to people, including people drawn to some of this stuff. But like, why do we have all these new books in school? Let's talk about it. By the way, if I was an 81-year-old white guy president, I would feel especially qualified and bulletproof talking people through this. It would be amazing to hear an 81-year-old white guy president say, you know what? I understand it's a little scary when your kids are reading books in school that you didn't read. Let me talk you through why we're doing it. And let me tell you, and by the way, to put a narrative on it, I think he could say, or someone in leadership could say, I think our country is so tough, so strong, that we can handle the truth, right? I think your kids are even tougher than you. Your kids are amazing. They can handle the truth, right? But we don't do that. We just like fight these things. These people are doing book ban. We don't tell a story about why the thing is happening, why the people are blocking the thing, and why we could block the blockers.
So you talked about, when you and I talked before, you said, stories don't write themselves, narratives don't write themselves. So who does write them?
Storytellers. And, in what we're talking about, there's narrowly, people who do storytelling in politics, politicians themselves, people who write speeches, people who do ads. But part of what I'm describing is a bigger project that, should be reflected in the kind of TV shows that get made and in the kind of art that gets made. There is this kind of bigger role. And again, I don't think we're all working in concert enough. So for example, I think I should step back and say, one of the reasons narrative turns out to be so important in political and civic life is when I was writing my book, The Persuaders, I learned from a lot of these people who do organizing work, activism, who do serious persuasion work, that their mental model of the people they're trying to convince is really different from most people's, right? When they look at a person who's kind of on the other side, maybe near other side, or maybe even far other side, they just see something differently from what I see, right? What I tend to see, I think what most of us tend to see, is a monolith on the other side, right? So you know that you're complicated. You know that you're all torn up inside. But you think of people far away from you as being kind of a solid block of whatever conviction worldview they are. What these persuaders I wrote about, the way they look at the world, they see people far away from them as being as internally at war with themselves as they know themselves to be, right? It's not an it is an empirical truth, but it's it's a rule of thumb that they just assume people are complicated. Okay, so when you assume people are it's a completely different assumption. So when you hear I don't know what percent, 35% of Americans very inflamed about an idea of the border right now. My assumption is well, we got a bunch of racist people who are really excited about the border right now. These persuaders who are better than me at this, they look at that as wow, we got 35% of our people who probably subscribe to a bunch of different possible narratives about how to view that kind of situation, who have been toggled very effectively right now into a very extreme right-wing frame for how to see that. Okay, so stick with that issue. What are some other narratives that those 35% who are currently inflamed about the border, what are some other narratives those people might hold that could be put into competition inside them, against their prejudice, right? A lot of Americans, for example, including in that group, view themselves as champions of the underdog. A lot of that 35% might support a team that never wins the championship, and they have a proud identity in never abandoning that team. Mm-hmm. Now, you may think that has nothing to do with politics or the border, but that's actually a really strong identity for a lot of people, right? A lot of people think of themselves as good Christians. Now, in the current moment, when they're part of that 35%, clearly that a lot of what's in the Bible is not effectively competing against a view they have, but it could. Mm-hmm. A lot of those people probably think of themselves as people who, as they would often say, don't have a racist bone in their body. Now, that identity right now is not outgunning the extremist view. But these persuaders, what they say you should do is not try to implant your view in the views of those people. It doesn't work, right? It's like a transplant that doesn't take. What they think you need to do is somehow toggle some of those other identities. Mm-hmm. Those other narratives that people have in them that are currently losing the battle for those people's individual souls, right? And the way this guy Steve DeLine is one of the inventors of deep canvassing. He said to me, I have come to learn, he does deep 45-minute canvassing of the doors around the country on immigration, other issues. He said, I've come to realize most people are 60-40 about most things. Okay? That's really an inspiring, and this is a guy who has spent more time than anyone in this room probably talking to prejudiced people on the door every day. Okay? Most people are 60-40 on most things. Well,
so the delta is 21%, not 100%.
And you need to, and most of these people are uncontacted by the kind of ideas that Steve DeLine or others might be bringing. They're watching Fox News 8 hours a day, right? I mean, if you're watching Fox News 8 hours a day and you're 60-40 on that kind of immigration policy, you are reachable, right? And I think again, going back to narratives are flimsy, actually, because they're just a frame put onto a very complicated reality. And once you realize that, it's actually very hope-giving because other narratives can be told, right? And do you remember when family separation happened under Trump? Right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That was, for some reason, for a lot of people on the right, it was like the straw that broke the camel's back. They couldn't take that. Now, I would argue our whole immigration system is humane, not just that. But great, if that's what got a bunch of Christian right-wing people to say that violates my values, that's an organizing opportunity, right? And so I think this notion that people are at war with themselves about everything, and therefore the job of people who want to fight for a different future is to toggle people into the more progressive things they can believe based on who they are, what they know, what they've seen, rather than implanting a microchip of your conviction in them.
Which is what we try to do. So that's when I was talking earlier about we need to persuade differently, because what we've been doing, which is trying to get them to believe exactly what we believe.
Or we debunk. Again, for those of you in long-term relationships, debunking doesn't work.
I don't want
fact-checking.
I don't want my husband to ever see this because I constantly show him how right I am.
Debunking doesn't work. Fact-checking people doesn't work. Helping to play up a buried part of someone else. And you know what's really challenging about that right now is we have not just in a divided time, polarized time, fallen out of love with each other as a country. We've fallen out of knowledge of each other. So it actually just takes like a sophisticated enough understanding of other people to even know if you're 60-40 right now in favor of a very intolerant view on the border, I need to know what the 40 could be. Mm-hmm. If I don't even know you enough, I've never met anybody like you, if I don't watch the same movies as you, eat the same, like, how am I going to even know what your 40 is? Mm-hmm. It takes a baseline civic understanding of what's going on with other people to be smart about wooing them into a different understanding of the world, you know? And I think that notion of persuasion requiring empathy, but I don't mean that in a soft way. I am talking about winning at the end of the day. Like, I'm talking about crushing movements of intolerance. But I'm talking about doing that by being very, very sophisticated about what's actually going on in the hearts of other people.
I need to let that sink in everybody let that sink in for a minute. And then you said something very powerful to me that I think this group needs to hear, and I don't know if I have it exactly, but I think you said the brain confuses discomfort with danger. Talk about that.
Yeah, it's a quote that I am working on a new book, and this is sort of a core thing, and I've seen this quote in many places, right? I've never been able to figure out who originally said it, if anybody. So hit me up if you know who originally said it. It's that human beings have a tendency to confuse discomfort with danger, right? And I think that could take all kinds of forms, you know. But in the context of what we're talking about now, in a society that has gone through a lot of change, where a lot of the ways people could behave, you can't behave that way anymore, thankfully. A lot of the people who were in rooms without other people are now in rooms with those other people. A lot of people who are not in the room are now in the room. There's discomfort. Mm-hmm. I think sociologist Jennifer Richardson, very smart, expert on demographic change and what it does to people, she calls it the democratization of discomfort. She's like, women and people of color have always been uncomfortable in this society. What is happening now is they are not sharing it. Like, the discomfort they experience is now being shared by white people and men, mm-hmm. who now have to also think about what they say in a meeting, right? Women were always thinking about what they were saying in a meeting when they were one of two women at a table of 20. They had to think more and stress more and be more anxious about it because of the dynamics of that room. What's now happening is the white guy in the room who's like, can I say that? He's just experiencing what a lot of other people always had to do, the self-editing, the worry, right? Living through the democratization of discomfort. I think that's real. And like maybe a little bit of discomfort in everybody, like the redistribution of discomfort is good, right? Like we all do this, like this kind of, you know, the right is so, like political correctness, whatever. Like, I think what happens is, I think all of us now, there's certain moments, I do this, I think I'm reasonably evolved on this, but there's like things where I'm like, wait, should I say that way or not? Would that be funny or degrading to that person in a way that I might not have said it, considered it, asked it to myself 5 years ago, 10 years ago, right? That discomfort is good. It's just literally a consideration mm-hmm. of what would the effects of what I do. It's like treating people the way you, like, seeing my own daughter there, like, you think a lot about what the effect you might mm-hmm. say or do on your kids. It's maybe treating them just like everybody else, with a little bit of that level of concern, anticipation. Mm-hmm. But I think what happens is a lot of people confuse that discomfort for danger. Right? So it's not just if I'm a white guy in the office, it's not just that I have to like watch myself a little more the way everybody always was, besides me, it's that I'm not safe, right? You may not articulate it that way, but clearly very large numbers of Americans now feel unsafe because of change and progress. And those are the folks, some of them.
Both physically and psychologically, or?
It becomes, yes, right? And we know from all this research these days that the boundary between physical and mental, and it's very fluid, right? And so, again, if you have that empathetic perspective, you would say, okay, I can understand the links between the guy in the meeting who feels like he's walking on eggshells and who comes home and is actually at some deep level kind of embarrassed that his kids are smarter than him, even though they're like 8, about American history because they're learning things he didn't learn. That's how it starts, right? You can just imagine how, if you have the right narrative-making infrastructure, that man could be funneled slowly to a place where he thinks there's an alien invasion on the border. You could imagine the alien this idea of something from the outside. This guy doesn't know about immigration. I mean, like, he's not an expert on these issues, right? But you could imagine how some of those very up-close experiences, like, I'm not sure I can speak, my kids I'm losing control over my kids, could be weaponized into I'm being invaded from without, right? And the way to fight that is to actually take seriously the fear, the emotion in its early form before it has been funneled into a position on the border, when it is still in the relatively healthy form of, like, I feel a little insecure about my kids. I feel a little awkward at work. Those are totally, you are not a bad person, and you are not racist, and you are not, like, just in that form, I feel I'm losing control of my kids. I mean, who doesn't, right? I feel bewildered by a new world in which I feel stupid and young people feel smart. I feel like I can't make easy conversation when I go to the drugstore anymore because these are people different from me now and they used to be people I grew up with. Those are all normal feelings. And I think it is totally possible that movements for progress can meet people where they are in those kind of emotions and walk them into a story about, here's why it's awesome that our country, unlike most countries in the world, is increasingly a country made out of the entire world. Here's why France is not doing that, Germany's not doing that, India's not doing that, China's not doing that, Nigeria's not doing that. We are a country making a relatively unique commitment to build a country made of the world where everybody has voice, everybody can realize the fullest versions of themselves. Isn't that awesome? And there's some housekeeping things we got to do to make that work. We got to read some different books than you read growing up, and your kids are going to read those books. You're going to sometimes meet someone at Walgreens who's a cashier who does not speak great English. Yes, that's going to happen. Yep. Just as your grandparents didn't speak English when they came from Italy or whatever. You're going to encounter discomfort. And here's why you're encountering it. Here is the project, the awesome project for which you have to deal with this discomfort. But if we don't tell that part of the story, then we're just subjecting people to discomfort and slightly shaming them for being uncomfortable and easily leading them into, or letting them be led into the mouths of wolves.
Okay, so I like to think I'm coachable.
You say coachable or poachable?
Coachable.
Okay.
So this is a moment for you, a teachable moment for you with me. Because I would have 2 normal reactions to that kind of behavior. First would be, if you're looking for sympathy, you need to go look for somewhere else. That would be my first reaction.
It's a normal reaction.
And my second reaction would be, It is not the job of the oppressed to explain oppression to the oppressor,
Exactly.
right? So now, with that starting point, how do I need to reframe it?
What you just said is so insightful because these are the two, I think, true and valid points of view that explain why we don't do this work. And so a couple of thoughts. First of all, we do not need, on your second point first, why should the oppressed help formerly privileged or still privileged people cope with the transition to more equality? We don't need most people doing this work. We don't need 98% of people doing this work. We need some people doing this work. And among women and among people of color and others, marginalized backgrounds, there are plenty of people who want to do this work and are doing this work. So let them do this work, right? We're talking about movement leaders. We're talking about people in communities. No one is suggesting that anybody has to do work they don't want to do, right? But there are remarkable organizers from marginalized backgrounds across this country, including the deep canvassing movement that grew out of the LGBT community in LA, where after they lost gay marriage in Prop 8 in 2008, the same night Obama won, a great night for America in general, but a very bad night for gay rights activists in California, a bunch of gay activists said, we want to go talk to our homophobic neighbors about, like, what the hell, guys? I think they lost LA by a majority in that vote. LA, 2008. They couldn't say this was like Kentucky people, right? They lost large parts of San Francisco in 2008. So it was a wake-up call for them. Now you can say, now they could have said, we're gay, we're victims of this law, like, we're not going to do this work. And you know what? It was fine if 99% of people, but fortunately, there was a small group of gay campaigners who were like, I refuse to believe that there is no possible self-understanding that large numbers of people in San Francisco and LA can have besides homophobia. I refuse that. And I think these people are like uncontacted by modernity, and I want to go contact them. And I'm very glad they did that. They turned that state around, and that movement then started winning state after state after state, right? So, no one has to do work they don't want to do, and I think we should recognize that some people in all of these communities, and right now in deep canvassing work in Colorado and Arizona, it is often undocumented people doing door-to-door canvassing on immigration. I don't think we should shame them for doing that. It's wild to me that people have the courage. People who fear to knock on the door their whole lives have the courage to go knock on random white people's doors in suburbs in Flagstaff, Arizona, to talk to them about their stories. But God bless them if they want to do that, and they're making change. The other part of it is, one of my mantras in life is that I think the burden of citizenship is that accepting that what is not your fault may be your problem. Mm-hmm. Okay? So this whole notion of like, well, it's not, I don't have it's not about sympathy in some kind of moral sense, that like, you know, this is I don't know the latest number, it's like a 75% white country, or 70% white country, still. It's quickly transitioning to not. But that's just the reality of who's here. Mm-hmm. And it's an electoral democracy, right? Someone, if we want to live in a future where more rooms can look like this, someone is going to have to do the work of moving a large number of that 70 whatever percent to a different understanding of themselves that was not available to their parents and grandparents. And I think sometimes in progressive spaces, this notion of like, I don't have, like, I'll give you a different example, take this totally out of politics. Someone said to me when I was doing the Persuaders book, when people have a heart attack or like condition like that, right? And the doctor will say, you have very serious cardiovascular conditions. You cannot eat the diet you've been eating ever again. You can eat like these 8 foods for the next year if you want to be alive a year from now. Mm-hmm. And I don't remember the number, but like basically the vast majority of people can't do it. So forget like white people coping with social change. You tell people you are going to be dead in a year if you can't change what you eat. And most people go with, well, I guess I'll be dead in a year. Okay? Like, that's how hard it is to change. People can't change their diet to stay alive. Just like think about that for a second. Like, this is the basic animalistic thing we all have, is like an animalistic desire to stay alive through eating. People can't change their diet to be alive 1 year from now. Okay. We are asking a country that when I was born in 1981 had a pretty different self-understanding of who an American was, who belonged, who didn't belong. I grew up around a pretty different understanding of what the we was, what the social contract was, what the story was. I'm sorry, but it is going to take not just policy change, but working millions of people into different stories for all of us to be safe. And if we sometimes take this pose of like, y'all show up at the promised land on your own time, like, we're just not going to be safe. Mm-hmm. And we're just going to lose a bunch of elections that endanger people. And so again, no one has to do work they don't want to do. But the burden of citizenship is accepting that what is not your fault is your problem. And I think, and again, it's not just white people, it's not just men, these transitions are everywhere. Helping people transition out of the industrial age into a more digital one, helping people transition out of dirty industries like coal. Like, it's not just a job change. You're going into communities and saying who you are, who your family is, everything you've invested your life in sucks, and actually has been ruining the world this whole time. That's a really tough thing to do. And you can give people a federal jobs guarantee or Green New Deal, but like, there's an affective problem there that if you don't pay attention to, someone else is going to get in there.
So here's what I heard you say to my question, which I would preach on a lot of other different platforms, but when it's personal, you know it's different, is that in order that I have to change in order for me to help someone else to change. Okay, that's number one. We know that's hard. But I think I can speak for a lot of people of color to say that change that you just described is going to be really hard for us, or for me, right? So it's work on both parts, and it's like how much of it can happen in parallel and how much of it has to happen in seriatim.
I mean, here's a way of answering that. I think sometimes we don't realize in America the uniqueness of the project right now. Okay, so my family comes from India originally. India's great, a lot of nice things to say about it. India is a country, like most countries in the world, India is a country for Indian people. India doesn't have a significant immigrant population. It's tough for me to get a visa to go to India. My friend Eric Liu wrote a memoir called The Chinaman's Chance. He was a speechwriter for Bill Clinton, Chinese American. I think his grandparents came to this country from China. He wrote something I never forgot. He said, my family has been like a Han Chinese family in China for 5,000 years. For 2 generations out of hundreds, we broke the chain and lived in Seattle. Mm-hmm. 2 generations. He said, if I, Eric Liu, were to move back to China right now, I couldn't get Chinese citizenship. I couldn't become Chinese. We make 1 million new citizens a year approximately in this country from all around the world. So this has been an era of being down on ourselves and being full of despair, and I think those of us who want this kind of multiracial democracy feel besieged for good reason. But we are actually attempting to do a thing that is rare in the world, if not unprecedented at this scale, that is very hard, and that I think is an incredibly worthy goal, right? And if we want to do that thing, I think it is, in a way, easy and a cop-out to say, we're going to need a bunch of policies, protect our voting rights and those kinds of things that pave the way to that multiracial democracy. The more interesting question is, like, this is a different way of behaving for all of us than has ever really existed. Most of our ancestors never met anyone, wherever you were in the world. Go back enough generations. Your ancestors didn't know people from 100 miles away. Your ancestors didn't know people whose skin was a little bit this way or that way, right? Like, this room is an absolute anomaly in human history. And the idea that we can just legislate to make it safe is a fantasy. It requires completely different sets of behaviors. It requires curiosity and openness and a willingness to be moved by others and to move others. It requires a capacity to be altered. And when I go to a lot of these other countries, which I love, and I get to travel a lot as a journalist, even places like France, it has an immigrant population, it has a people of color population, but France is a French country for French people with a blood and soil conception of Frenchness. And I realize when I go to France, like, America, for all its sins, is absolutely not that. It is absolutely not that, right? And so it's easy to be France in a way. You just keep saying, this is Frenchness, you like it or not. We're doing this thing where, like, every day we are renegotiating the meaning of everything based on more and more people being in the room. And I think it's a fantasy to believe that it's not going to be work for all of us. It's going to be work and adjustment and alteration constantly for all of us. But that discomfort is not danger.
So that brings up all kinds of questions I don't have time to ask, like accommodating white fragility and what if everybody's not, what if one group of people are working harder than another group of people? But in the time we have left, I want to ask you this. What are the two most toxic narratives on the street today that we should be all in about?
I mean, I think the overriding one, to stick with what we were talking about, is that what we are building as a country made of the world, a country made of people from everywhere, a multiracial democracy, that it can't work. In a way, there's a very facile, like, racist version of that on the right, and then there's like a upmarket one that you might hear from, like, a smart, educated person like J.D. Vance, who's able to put a kind of intellectual gloss on it. I think what J.D. Vance would say is it's like unworkable, right? It's just an unworkable, like, it's unprecedented in history for a reason. I don't believe that. And, when Donald Trump threatened that if we continued to have immigrants to this country, there would be taco trucks on every corner, I was among those who felt very excited. I just hope they have birria tacos included. But I do think that narrative, whether you're coming from the strictly racist point of view of like, this is a white civilization that is being contaminated, or the upmarket view of like, this doesn't work. It doesn't work for people without shared history, without shared religion, without shared everything to hold as a nation. It really makes it imperative on us to prove the converse, right? And by showing, not telling, right? Part of what was not working in the last weeks of the Biden campaign that feels like it flipped with Kamala is that the movement for multiracial democracy can't just be a movement of the head, like this is right, this is important. It's got to feel fun, right? The far right in recent years has weirdly allowed itself, made itself, the more fun side. If you watch that Republican convention, it was like a joyous thing. And all too often, movements for progress, movements for more democracy are like tedious and legalistic and judgy and like gatekeeping, just in their affect, not what they're fighting for, the opposite. And I think part of just what Kamala Harris happens to embody based on who she is like, no, like saving democracy should be a blast. Like democracy should be a blast, like taco trucks in every corner, like, right? Like, this should be a movement that is a better party, not a better political party, like a better Saturday night party. It should feel like something that people want to get into, waiting in the street to get into. And I think the second toxic narrative out there is that people, and this is widely held, is that people are who they are and can't change. You know, as the heart attack example illustrates, it is very difficult for people to change. But I think the notion that people are incapable of changing is also wrong. And we have to live in between that notion that it's hard. But it happens. It happens all the time. Right? If you are a gay person in this room, when you were a teenager 20 years ago, whatever, like, did you think we'd be further ahead of where we are? My guess is you thought it would take much longer than it has to get to where we've gotten, right? And I think you could run down the list. So people change. People change all the time. We change individually, we change societally. And I think when we give up on that notion that people can change, it sounds like it's pessimistic about them, but it's actually pessimistic about us. Mm-hmm. Because if we don't believe people are alterable by each other, we have no business doing democracy. Democracy is premised on the idea of the potential that we could alter each other. And if we can't alter each other, if talking to each other, showing each other pieces of art, showing each other will and grace, if that doesn't move anybody, then we should just have a king or a strong man to make decisions. And I refuse that to believe that. Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything you wanted to share with us that you haven't had a chance to yet?
I'm grateful, always grateful for the chance to talk with you and grateful to be here again. Look, I think we have to, those of us who want that bigger we, those of us who want that conception of the country that is more democracy, more justice, more freedom for more people, for all of us, no exceptions. I think we need to shake off the funk. Mm-hmm. I think we have to remember that we are not losers besieged by extremists, but we are actually, in a slightly longer view, winners who have been winning so hard, so repeatedly in changing the meaning and status of lots of people in this country, that we have inflamed a very typical resentful backlash of a minority of people who have always been there in American history, different bodies, mm-hmm. different names, but that same 25%. We should remember that every generation there has been a contest between this bigger we and smaller we, Do we get rid of slavery or not? Do we have labor protections in the Industrial Revolution or not? Do we give women suffrage or not? Do we have labor protections in the New Deal or not? Do we have child labor or not? Do we integrate schools or not? Do we protect people from dirty air and dirty water or not? Do we have gay rights or not? If you look down the list I just gave you,
I think in the end, we always win.
in the end, we always win. And I actually start to feel sorry for those people, you know? And in every one of those contests, there was that faction, the small-hearted faction. It's the same damn faction, just different bodies, different names. And so it just puts it in a context of movements for progress have been winning, have won a lot, and will keep winning. And I think we have to stop despairing so much, even though there's a lot to be alarmed about, and act like winners, building a bigger, better future for all people. Be patient and empathetic about the fact that it's going to take some people longer and more work than others to be pulled into that vision, but ultimately they will be pulled. And that these miserly figures from the small-hearted faction are not steering the ship of state right now. They're barnacles at the bottom of our boat. And I think we'll defeat them.
Thank you. Please show your thank you. So what are we going to talk about next year?
I don't know.
All right, we'll see you back then.
Our new president, Kamala Harris.
So,
Maybe we'll do like a 3-person panel with her.
yeah, I like that
Gotta
idea.
get the invitation in now before she gets big,
Yeah.
before she blows up.
Good idea. All right, I think that we need, Rose is going to make an announcement, then we'll exit after that.
Hi, folks. Just a quick note, we believe the closed captioning issue has been fixed. They've been working on that. But, however, if you'd like to listen into the English audio in amplified, like if you need to hear it more amplified, please see one of the back tables, the CLC tables, and we'll make sure we get you a headset so that you can listen to the audio, the English audio amplified. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll take a break until 11 o'clock. Is that o'clock? Yep, thank you.